Hi, everybody. It is Saturday night at 8, and this is Joe Firestone live tonight. I'm Joe Firestone for Real Progressives, and our topic for today is a week of dismay and anger. And hi, Dr. J. The first thing we get is Dr. J. The only thing we need to complete this is get a Dr. K on here. Then we'd have a Dr. J and a Dr. K as the New York Nets had way back. When was it? In the 1960s, 1970s. Something like that. Anyway, there I am, Dr. J. And, okay, I guess we're ready to start. Okay. So, there were lots of things that happened this week, and we're going to discuss them tonight. First, there was a Nation article dealing with the denial of basic First Amendment rights during the J20 protests in January. Some 240 people were kettled and were then arrested. Some of them were released, but 200 people were retained and then charged. They were charged at first with a single felony, and then later the charges were upped by another 7 felonies or something like that. And the end result was that if anybody is convicted on this before protesting, they could serve as much as 70 years in the clinker. So why did this happen? Well, we'll get into some of the justifications soon, but some of the other things that happened during the week include the debate between Bernie and Ted Cruz on taxes, on the subject, of taxes. The progressive view of taxes represented by Bernie, and the conservative ideas on taxes that were represented by Ted Cruz. We'll talk about the results of that particular debate very briefly. There seem to be some interruptions going on the stream right now. I can see my picture is flicking in and out, and I don't know why. So bear with me. Allison Drecker says, no, Dr. K is Stephanie Kelton. Yes, but we haven't had the pleasure of her appearance on this show yet, unfortunately, Allison. So when we do, we'll be able to say that we have a Dr. J and a Dr. K here, but not yet, unfortunately. So, we also have the purge of the progressive Democrats from the DNC. That happened also this week. And then on Thursday night, the Republicans passed a Senate budget. And it was a budget that was devoted to maintaining fiscal fantasy. And then Keith Ellison replied in an email and referred to the budget offered by the Congressional Progressive Caucus as the budget for the 99%. And for reasons we'll go into later, that budget also maintained fiscal fantasy. So there we have it. We have the Senate's rather rightist fiscal fantasy. And then we have Keith Ellison and the People's Caucus budget, which is the headline progressives fiscal fantasy. And both were offered in, shall we say, debates in Washington this week. And then there was also Tim Canova replying to the purge of the Democrats from the DNC. And Tim talked about, in one of his emails, he talked about the Dem enter and Dem exit strategies once again. And we'll see what he had to say about that. And then finally, there was the reminder this week that we have coming up either in November, or maybe December, the coming FCC vote on net neutrality. And we've been kind of waiting for that for some time. The FCC appears ready to destroy net neutrality. However, not without a fight from us. And the fight is beginning now. So let's get to talking about all of those items, which should give us plenty to do tonight. And after we've finished with some talking about them, we'll have the usual rather long Q&A to see what you have to say about it and what thoughts you would like to add about these nude items and what they have to say about our likely futures. So let's begin with the J20 prosecutions. The First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of the grievances. Keeping that in mind, the story of the J20 protesters should frighten anyone concerned about the future of both free assembly and dissent in the United States. That, by the way, is a quote from The Nation. Continue to quote from them. The charges, which include felony rioting, inciting or urging others to riot, conspiracy to riot, and property destruction, all stem from the same mass arrest during which police indiscriminately swept up protesters, journalists, and legal observers. Yes, they did. And once prosecutors had them all swept up, they failed to allege that the bulk of defendants, that is the bulk of the 200 people that they're retaining for prosecution, did anything specifically unlawful. Rather, merely being at the protest was a crime. And when the whole charging process was completed, and the other 7 charges were added, the potential in penalties, which could be suffered by these 200 people, was up to 70 years in jail for participating in a protest. Now, this prosecution and the way the protesters were collected for arrest was obviously designed to chill the exercise of our First Amendment rights. And this represents a considerable danger to our rights right now, depending on how the case is actually decided. This should be an open and shut case. That is to say, those 200 protesters were exercising their rights under the First Amendment of the Constitution. Some of the people, a fairly small number by all accounts, engaged in some property destruction. So clearly, they should perhaps have been charged for property destruction as individuals, individually charged, and then put through the trial process. All of the rest, other than that handful of people, should have been dismissed without any charges. An apology should have been made to them for detaining them unlawfully for the exercise of their rights under the Constitution of the United States. Okay, now let me say, this is not the first time this has happened. This kind of thing, maybe not the charging with felony crimes, but this kind of hurting people and kettling them and mass arresting them has been going on since the Occupy movement and was a favorite tactic for repressing the Occupy movement. It has been and continues to be a wholesale violation of civil liberties and civil rights under the Constitution of the United States. And we as a people do nothing about it. We allow these violations to continue. We do not punish the perpetrators. We do not fine them. We do not send them to prison. We do not enforce the law against them. It is time we started. Actions like this are forbidden under the Constitution. There should be no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Congress should pass laws tomorrow guaranteeing the protection of the exercise of free speech and free assembly and the right to petition for grievances. There should be tough laws to protect these rights. We are tired of having the Constitution violated by local police forces, by mayors, in this case, by the Washington, D.C. police force, and by the Department of Justice who handles the prosecutions in these places. This is not America. This is not America. This is dictatorial rule. This is fascism. This has to stop. It's got to stop here. I hope the courts will protect us by making courageous decisions in this instance and by throwing out all the prosecutions because even in the cases where there was some property destruction, I believe the destruction was fairly minor and should probably not be subject to felony prosecution. All involved that were arrested during these protests were overcharged in order to chill constitutional rights and the exercise of those rights. And this did not even only proceed in terms of the arrest of these people. It proceeded in another way too. When the prosecutor tried to get from an internet host service, the Dream Host service, data about the people who participated in organizing these peaceful protests, tried to get information about the messages they sent to each other before the protests. Now, DreamHost courageously resisted, and the Department of Justice withdrew its requests but from them. Okay, but in addition to that, the organization of those protests drew 6,000 likes on Facebook, and the Department of Justice tried to get Facebook data on those who liked the page which announced and publicized the J2 protest events, wanting perhaps to go on a fishing expedition to see if anyone who organized it was somehow involved in what they saw as felony behavior. So, if they had been successful in getting this information, and then later people were prosecuted for participating in online behavior, and not even for being at the protest, this surely would have had a chilling effect on all dissent which goes on over the internet. It would certainly have had a chilling effect on Real Progressives itself, since our page has been liked by 120,000 people. Are those people to be subject to inquiries from the Department of Justice based on a desire to engage in a fishing expedition? Let us hope it does not come to that. And let us also hope that the Department of Justice is immediately slapped down for these kinds of activities by the courts, which are charged to protect us under the Constitution from violations of the Constitution by the civil authorities. This has simply got to stop. Hopefully the courts will defend us. But if they don't, then we will have to take matters into our hands and go after the politicians who protect the police forces around the country when they engage in these tactics. So, the debate between Bernie and Ted Cruz over taxes. Well, first of all, in the only online poll I've seen, which is the Heavy poll, heavy.com, which does have a Bernie bias, apparently, during the primary debates with Hillary Clinton. One had a situation where Bernie was winning most of those debates by 85%, 90%, 93%. So it appears the people who answer that poll are people who see themselves as being fairly progressive. Okay. Nevertheless, Bernie won this fairly overwhelmingly by 70 to 27. Last time the two debated, Bernie won by 48 to 46 in that same poll. So Bernie did a lot better this time, and his margin was probably large enough to say that even if there was not a leftish bias to the poll, that Bernie got the better of things. But did he really win that poll? Or did he give up before he got started? There was no attempt by Bernie during the debate to educate people about monetary sovereignty or the need for deficit spending when you have a trade deficit, or the fact that taxes do not fund spending, or really any aspect of the actual monetary realities that govern our financial system and that apply to our fiscal and our monetary policies. No attempt at education at all. Instead, what Bernie did was to talk in terms of and to reinforce the progressive give-up formula here, which tries to defend the policies of the progressives against the conservatives, using the conservatives' own neoliberal economic framing of things. The framing of things that says that it's a bad thing to run deficits. The framing of things that says that we have real fiscal solvency constraints and we have to limit our deficit spending as a result. The framing that says that when we want to spend for public purpose, we have to make sure that it's paid for by running deficits that are not too large or that don't exist at all. He answered in those terms, and that created a great deal of dismay and consternation in real progressive ranks, as I don't think I have to tell you, because we all felt it. 2018 is rapidly approaching now. 2016 has come and gone. And 2017, the beginning of the resistance against Donald Trump, supposedly, is now 3/4 of the way through, more than 3/4 of the way through. And Bernie is making no new departures from the memes of the 2016 and earlier campaigns, which the Democrats were using and which led to their defeat in 2016. Now, I know that it's arguable that it was really a defeat because the popular vote was won and there was a lot of cheating and voter suppression and stripping and flipping, okay, and other things that in the end probably gave the electoral vote to Donald Trump. But that doesn't change the reality that the same thing is going to happen, perhaps even to a greater extent in 2018. We're going to get voter suppression. We're going to get voter discouragement to cope with. We're going to get stripping and flipping. We're going to get the dirtiest tactics which the Republicans can muster to defeat Democratic candidates and especially progressive candidates. And we're going to have to win out in spite of those disadvantages. So, if you theorize and say, well, it still would have been a close election, but we probably would have won by 52% or 53% of the electoral votes, rather than lost by just a few thousand votes in a few states, which created the electoral victory for Donald Trump. What we have to say now is that we have to have an overwhelming enough victory to compensate for those dirty tricks and dirty tactics and for the voter suppression and for everything else they might throw at our forces. That's our job. We know it's going to happen. Excuses don't accomplish anything. Even if they're valid, even if things would have turned out in a different way if it had been a fair election. The truth is, we're not going to see a fair election anytime soon. So we have to win the unfair elections. We have to take power from them through the unfair elections. That is what we have to do. So we have to stop excusing ourselves and rationalizing and moaning and groaning. We have to win in spite of the unfairness of it all. So, what new departures is Bernie making to make himself still more attractive to people? When he comes out with a good, though not a great bill, in the form of his Medicare for All bill, when he comes out with his criticisms of the Republican looting and the tax giveaway and the corruption, what new departure is he making that can get him in 2018 the extra votes for us that we need and that he might need in 2020 if he runs again, or that another progressive might need in 2020 if they run in his place? What new departures is he making to wipe out that unfair advantage that the neoliberals have in our elections? I think the answer is that thus far he's making no new departures. He is not attempting to educate people further at all. All the trips around the country have been very nice in keeping him a popular figure, keeping him in the game, as it were. And that's essential. But he has to use his position in the game to advance the debate. And I don't see him doing that. He would have wiped the floor with Cruz in the tax debate. if he had brought forward from the beginning the MMT narrative. Now, obviously, he didn't want to attack the Democrats. He would have had to attack the Democrats every bit as much as the Republicans if he did that. That is to say, the Democrats continue to be a burden on a progressive narrative. They continue to be a burden. How do we get around that particular burden? Well, we're not getting any closer, because this past week also we saw the purge of the progressive Dems, of some of the progressive Dems anyway, some very important ones, from the Democratic National Committee. There were the DNC announcements of the firing of a number of Bernie and or Keith Ellison supporters from their positions at the DNC. They were replaced by the partisans of Tom Perez, and the Clintonians, the Clinton wing of the Democratic Party, now combined with the Obama wing of the Democratic Party. They were replaced from partisans of those wings. They were driven off the Rules Committee entirely. The Rules Committee is a key committee that virtually determines the nomination, who it will fall to. Last time, it was that key committee that set up the superdelegates for Hillary Clinton, and that set up the situation for the cheating in the debates that was accomplished by, and the whole primary campaign that was accomplished by Debbie Wasserman Schultz and her assistants, and by Donna Brazile. And guess what? Just a day after the purging of the Bernie and Keith Ellison supporters, Tom Perez announced that Donna Brazile, she of the rigged Democratic debates fame, was appointed as a DNC delegate. So we have Perez's multiple fuck you folks to the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Of course, this caused an outcry. It caused an outcry. But it's important to recognize the ultimate consequence of these moves by the Clinton wing of the party depends on us. They're sending us a message, and the message is, if Hillary's healthy in 2020, she's running again, and we're going to nominate her. And if she doesn't run again, it will still be a corporatist, such as Kamala Harris, who is going to run and who will be nominated by the Democratic Party for the presidency. That's what they're telling us. They're also telling us that in the 2018 elections, the progressive candidates, like, for example, Tim Canova, if he's successful in the primaries, won't be getting Democratic Party funds. Those funds will be going to the Blue Dog Democrats. They'll be going to people like Claire McCaskill of Tennessee, of the Missouri senator. They'll be going to Steve Cohen, okay, but Tennessee, if he's still in the Congress. they'll be going to blue dogs who have hung around there for a long time and who are constant supporters of the neoliberal Clintonian philosophy, okay, of government. And we progressives will have to fundraise on our own without assistance from the party, which is fine. But what should it tell you and I? Well, it should tell us actually a number of things. The first thing, okay, that it should tell us is don't ever give any money to Democratic Party committees or to the DCCC or to the Democratic senatorial committees. No money and no support for these people. They have already lost our support, should have lost it, for the 2018 elections and for the 2020 elections. Now, that doesn't mean we vote against all Democrats. What I advise is this. When we vote in elections, we vote on issues. We vote on policy agendas. We vote for those people who promise to support our policy agendas. And in this respect, we get to our next event of last week. In an email to his followers, Tim Canova replied to the purge in the party by saying, and I'm quoting Tim now, some progressives have suggested that this purge is intended to divide the party. Why else appoint someone as controversial as Brazil? That the purpose of this purge is to fuel a so-called Dem exit and drive the progressives out of the Democratic Party. And he goes on, although the party would be smaller and weaker, this would also make it easier for the corporate Democratic establishment to control the party's rules and the choice of nominees for offices all across the country. And he goes on, let's not take the bait by giving up our efforts to reclaim the Democratic Party. Now is the time to fight back. Defeating the notorious Debbie Wasserman Schultz would send the loudest and clearest signal that we, the people, cannot be purged, that we are strong in numbers and unified in our vision, and that we will overcome all of their obstacles. Now, I have to say that I don't favor Dem enter, and I don't favor Dem exit, except for particular strategic purposes. Now, in Tim's case, he's a candidate for Congress who by and large agrees, from what I've seen of his positions, he by and large agrees with the real progressives policy agenda. He's also one of the few candidates for Congress I've seen thus far, whether independent or whether in one of the major parties, who recognizes that there is a monetary reality that is described by modern money theory. And he respects that particular reality. And he pays attention to that reality when crafting his policies. And not only that, on the issue of what we're going to do about citizens by United, he is for passing campaign finance laws and having Congress remove the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court over those laws so that they cannot hear appeals brought by conservatives against those laws, but brought by the defenders of the big donors who want to control politics. He's the only candidate that I've seen thus far who will subscribe to such a position. As far as I know, he's the only candidate who knows about it, unless there are a few candidates who have heard me on this program and who have also picked it up. But I think Tim knows about it through his own efforts because he teaches law. And he knows that power of Congress is there. How about a constitutional amendment? Well, the constitutional amendment will take an awfully long time to pass. And meanwhile, we'll have to contend with all that money going to the neoliberals in politics. If we were ever to have an election victory, and were ever to have enough people in Congress to pass campaign finance laws again, we have to have a section of each of those laws that removes the jurisdiction of the appellate courts relative to the constitutionality of those laws. Those laws with such a provision are the only way of, in the long run, restoring our democracy to us. We must remove the role of big money in politics. And given the Supreme Court we have now, this is the only way that can happen. Now, of course, if we were to have an overwhelming election victory, we then might do various things to force the resignation of many of these justices, or failing that, to pack the Supreme Court so that we wouldn't have to call on the provisions of Article 3, Section 2. But what I'm telling you is we need such campaign finance laws. We need to deal these people out of the process and make them like us, having the influence, of individuals who are active in politics, but not having the influence of big dollars behind them. That's imperative if we want to restore our democracy. So, what I say is, we have to look at candidates on a case-by-case basis. Now, Tim Canova is a great candidate, and I don't care if he's running as a Democrat or he's running as a Green or he's running as a Democrat or whether he's running as a candidate of entirely different party, not yet formed. He'd still be a great candidate with great issue positions. He's bright. He's articulate. He appears to be very, very honest. He's our man. Whether it's Dem enter or Dem exit, ought to depend on whether we need to vote for somebody like that. If we need to have access for the Democratic primary in his district, then we might want to dem enter or refrain from dem exiting. But whether we want to dem exit or dem enter needs to be based on those conditions. Now on Monday, here at RP, on Savage Joy's program, which I believe is coming on at 7 o'clock on Monday, she will have John Lancelot and also Jessica Penny debating the dem enter versus dem exit question. I think it's going to be a very, very interesting debate. And I urge you to watch on Monday, because that debate is really going to be fun, I think. I don't know about Jessica Penny, but John Lancelot is very well informed and very bright and very articulate. And many of you already know him here. And he will do a great job for his side of the question. And Joy will do a great job of moderating the debate. So for me, this shapes up as a real treat on Monday night at 7 o'clock. Okay, the next thing that happened this week was that we had this new Senate budget, which worked very hard to maintain the fiscal fantasy that somehow we need to restrain our deficit spending. Anyway, the Senate passed a budget resolution on Thursday night, not an appropriations bill. Okay, a budget resolution is different. It provides guidelines for the budget. It clears the way for committees in the Senate to begin work on the budget. Now, their leaders are charging the Republicans to begin work on a reported $1.5 trillion tax reform. Now, whenever they talk tax reform, these days, you better hold on to your pocketbooks and your wallets, because they're going to reform a lot of money out of your wallet, and they're going to reform a lot of money into the wallets of the 1% or the 110%, and especially the 1,000th of 1%. They'll reform a lot of money into Donald Trump's wallet and the wallet of his family. You can be sure of that. The process they're going through is legal looting. Their purpose is to protect the $1.5 trillion tax cut from a filibuster by the Democrats in the Senate. How do they get around the filibuster? Well, the budget resolution that passed basically authorized the Senate to pass a budget reconciliation bill if one was presented to the Senate by the House. If you pass a bill through reconciliation, it requires only a majority vote. and limited time for debate. It requires an up or down vote, and it creates a situation where the Democrats cannot use the filibuster. No 60 votes are necessary. And the Republicans wanted that because even though they could repeal the filibuster instantly, they want to be in the position of claiming that they protected the filibuster so that if the Democrats do regain control of Congress in the elections of 2018, or at least of the Senate in about 2018, that the result of that would be that they'd be able to say, well, it wasn't us who got rid of the filibuster. It's not us getting rid of the filibuster. It's the damn Dems. So both parties play this game, wanting to get around having to use the filibuster, but God forbid they should get rid of it with respect to legislation. That said, the Democrats have gotten rid of it with respect to certain judicial appointments, and the Republicans then one-upped them by getting rid of it with respect to Supreme Court appointments and high-level cabinet appointments also. So now it largely remains only with respect to legislation. And with respect to fiscal legislation, they get around it by doing a reconciliation bill. When they do that, the reconciliation bills have to prove through a CBO analysis that they are fiscally neutral over a 10-year period, which is a very convenient rule for excluding fiscal bills passed by reconciliation that might involve the kind of deficit spending that we need to solve most of our problems. So the people who wrote the rules for these bills, the neoliberals who wrote these rules for the Congress, were very careful in how they wrote them so that their view of faux fiscal responsibility would govern everything. What the new Senate budget bill would also do, apart from protecting a $1.5 trillion tax cut from the filibuster, it would also pave the way for opening up the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska to oil exploration by ensuring that drilling legislation can pass with only Republican votes. Also coming from the resolution of the budget resolution. It wasn't really a revolution in any sense of the term, only more of the same of what we've been getting for years and years now, starting with the Obama administration. It included aspirational cuts in the budget plans, which called for slicing more than $1 trillion over 10 years from the Medicaid program, or $100 billion a year, a very sizable amount from the Medicaid program. And about $470 billion from the Medicare program over a decade. That averages roughly $47 billion a year and is not as serious a cut because it's a lower percentage of the Medicare program. And the Medicare program might be able to adapt to it if that passes. But all that said, these are aspirational cuts. There's plenty of time to pressure the House and to pressure the Senate in order to make sure that these cuts never get into the final appropriation bills. So this is the opening gun in another war to slice money out of the Medicaid program and to begin cutting the Medicare program. It's only the opening gun in that war. There's plenty of time to counterattack. But we should counterattack very, very strongly about that right now. Now let's talk about the tax cuts, okay, for a minute. The $1.5 trillion tax reform is likely to place a heavier burden on poorer people and on the middle class. We're going to lose some money from the tax reform while more money is given to the very well off. This will be justified based on the idea that taxes fund spending and that these extremely well-off people are the job creators. Now, everybody in America by now must know that's a load of bullshit. They must have learned that by now, that both of those claims are just a load of bullshit. That said, however, we also need to note that there is a $1.5 trillion deficit that's expected if a bill like this were to pass over a 10-year period, or roughly $150 billion per year. Now that tightens the screws on the private sector somewhat, because it comes out of, no, I shouldn't say tightens the screws in that sense. What I meant to say, okay, is that it does give a very low stimulus to the private sector of $150 billion a year, but because of the multiplier effect, which in this case involves the very well-off saving their money and taking it out of the economy, essentially. If we're dealing with basically 30 cents on the dollar, and we're dealing with $150 billion a year tax cut, then we're dealing with a cut of $45 billion in consumption power. 45 billion, 150 times 30, yeah, 45 billion stimulus each year to the private sector in terms of an increase in demand. That's the primary multiplier. When it all shakes out, okay, it would be a little more, maybe a stimulus of 50 to 55 billion a year, which does go some way towards offsetting the trade deficit. Assuming the trade deficit is going to be 3% a year, we're looking at trade deficits in the area of $600 to $7 billion a year going out of the U.S. Economy. So 45 billion going into it from additional deficit spending doesn't do much for us, doesn't do much in terms of averting the recession that is likely to happen, because the levels of aggregate saving in the private sector over the last number of years have been getting smaller and smaller, and the private sector has mainly been growing. The so-called boom that we now see in the private sector uh, has been continuing based on burgeoning debt once again. In other words, we're again in a boom phase of the boom and bust cycle. The stimulus that's provided by this particular tax cut is unlikely to keep us from the bust because it is far too small. So that needs to be said. This bill is seriously deficient in not providing for deficit spending that would put net financial assets into the pockets of the poor and the middle class, who are likely to spend back those net financial assets into a growing economy, actually producing things that people value. Okay. It's a very, very poor budget for that. And any expectations that people might have about this tax cut actually growing the economy rapidly or creating a new prosperity for us are just silly. That's not going to happen. We're going to continue with stagnation until finally there is another crash and the need for substantial fiscal intervention from the government. But then we have the progressives and Keith Ellison replying with the People's Caucus budget. The People's Caucus budget, which also maintains the neoliberal fiscal fantasies contained in the progressive give-up formula that is practiced by our progressive friends in Washington these days, if we truly have any progressive friends there at all. What Keith says about that is that the people's budget is about liberty and justice for all. It's an upfront investment in middle-class families and those working to get there. Here are just some of the ways it levels the playing field and gives everybody a shot at the American dream. It lowers prescription drug prices and allows states to transition to single-payer health care. Okay. In other words, reinterpreting that, what that is telling us is that the Congressional People's Caucus, the supposed caucus for the 99%, is not even brave enough to advocate straight out there for H.R. 676, the Medicare for All bill, which is the purest expression of a universal health care bill on the table right now for Congress to consider. As you know, I don't care for the taxing provisions of that bill and wish they would simply deficit spend it all. But the benefits in that bill are wonderful and would be implemented immediately. And then this budget, says Keith, would also raise taxes on the millionaires, the billionaires, the Wall Street firms, and the corporations that offshore jobs. Implicit in that is the idea that we want to punish the millionaires, the billionaires, the Wall Street firms, and the corporations that offshore jobs. Now, I'm as fond of punishment for those who deserve to be punished as the next person is. But really, do we want to fight a pitched battle over raising taxes on millionaires, billionaires, Wall Street firms, and corporations? Or do we want to pass bills that give us Medicare for all, that give us a federal job guarantee, that give us the kind of climate legislation we need, the kind of educational system we need? Yes, to some degree, it is an either-or choice, because while we can use the threat of increased taxation as a bargaining counter, it only works as a bargaining counter if ultimately we're willing to back off of it and to accept a bill that would deficit spend for these things rather than raise taxes to pay for these things. Let us not forget that when we raise taxes, we destroy the net financial assets of people. We destroy demand in the economy, in the domestic economy. Do we have such high demand right now that we can afford to destroy some of it? I just don't see that. We can do that later. Once we've won a number of elections, once we've delivered for people, once they trust us, then we can consider sin taxes and punishment taxes and taxes for discouraging undesirable behavior. Okay, the Pigovian taxes. And guess what? The people's budget wants to establish an audit of the Pentagon budget. Well, I want to establish an audit of the Pentagon budget too. It would be nice to have such an audit. That might be a relatively easy thing to get compared to taxes on the millionaires, the billionaires, and so on. So we would just have to see, but I don't want to die on that hill either. I don't think we ought to die on that hill, or that a progressive agenda ought to die on that hill either. It will be time to die on that hill 2 or 3 years down the road. I don't think that's a number one priority. And the progressive budget, the CPC budget, makes college debt-free for all American students and reinvests in K-12 public education. Well, as I recall it, it's not exactly making it debt-free, is it? Okay, it doesn't provide for a jubilee of student loans outstanding right now. Okay, it also only provides, if I recall, for free tuition, okay, for all American students. And college doesn't cover graduate school or medical school or law school, all of which involve heavy debts for our students. So this too is pretty much weak tea, barely beyond the Hillary Clinton proposals of 2016. So, okay, the budget creates public funding of campaigns to curb the influence of money in our elections. Well, you know, there's so much of that money now that it's going to be very hard to curb it with the pittance of public funding that it might be possible to make available. What I think we need is legislation that removes campaign financing from the wealthy donors and from the corporations. Just prohibits it outright. Then, if we had public financing of campaigns, that would be good in order to democratize our campaigns and to reclaim our democracy. And the budget closes tax loopholes that benefit only corporations and the ultra-wealthy and ends taxpayer-funded subsidies for the fossil fuel industries. Well, we certainly should do that to the extent that we can. But once again, that's not a hill that I want to die on right now. I'd much rather give substantial subsidies to other industries competing with the fossil fuel industries. Of course, the best of all possible worlds is give them subsidies and cut out the subsidies for the fossil fuels and even actually make the fossil fuel producers pay for the cost of their externalities. That would make me very, very happy. But again, that's not a hill that I want to die on within the first 3 months or 4 months or 6 months. Maybe when we get to doing climate action, then it would be time to do something like that. But there's very little in the Congressional Progressive Caucus to help us with the climate action, to help us to solve our climate change problems. We have to get that done. We have to get that going. And the final point that's made by Keith is that this budget invests $2 trillion to rebuild our outdated water, transportation, and energy infrastructure, putting Americans all across the country back to work. Well, as I've said in previous broadcasts, that's not enough. It's only an average of $200 billion a year. Well, we need something more like an average of $700 billion a year to really do the job. You don't start at $200 billion a year. You ask for the $700 billion a year, or even more than that. And then you bargain down to something that will solve the problem. You don't start from a position that will not solve the problem and then bargain down from there. That's not going to save our lives. So the next piece of bad news is the coming FCC vote on net neutrality. That's likely going to be on the FCC agenda for November or December. It has not formally been placed on the agenda yet because the FCC commissioners want to try to have the vote when people aren't looking. They want to do it around Thanksgiving. They want to do it around the Christmas season when people are not watching them. That's what they want to do. We have to keep the pressure on. We have to accelerate it. We have to get in front of their houses. We have to disrupt them wherever they are until our net neutrality is safe from the huge service providers who want to contain our free speech on the internet. That's what this is about. The neoliberals want to make us less effective politically, and they know the way to do that is to provide slow lanes for us on the internet and eventually provide lanes that perhaps do not work at all if they're coming from us. Well, maybe Facebook would be against that because if it wants to have people doing things on Facebook, it can't allow things to get too slow, or they'll just forget about Facebook. They just won't be on here at all. So they have a vested interest, perhaps, in fighting this. But they better help us fight damn hard, because it's going to be a tall order to try to beat them with the makeup of the FCC right now. It's going to be a tall order, because the chair of the FCC now, Ajit Pai, is a neoliberal par excellence. He just doesn't think that there's a role for net neutrality unless it can be shown that to him that such an arrangement is good for the market. So his test is it good for the market? It's not, is it good for public purpose? Or is it good for our democracy? Or is it good for the people? No, that's not what he's concerned about. Okay, so what does this tell us? The confluence of these 6 things this week. It tells us again what a mess we're in with this administration. No action on Medicare for all, no action on a federal job guarantee, no action on expanding Social Security, no action on a debt jubilee for students, no action on protecting all Americans from violence, especially from violence by authorities. No action on budgets that will use all the policy space that is available to us. No action on infrastructure. No action on educational reform. We have an administration that is trying to rig elections by disenfranchising people. An administration that's trying to intimidate both ourselves and the press, especially the alternative media. An administration whose members are trying to make side deals to benefit themselves. We also have no action on climate change. We have no action on expanding the social safety net and strengthening the poor one we have now. Instead, we have action attempting to make damaging cuts to the social safety net. We have an administration and a Congress that supports looting by the police and looting of people traveling through local areas by police. We have an administration that will not do anything about student loan debt, nor that will do anything about the immigration mess that we have, nor that will do anything for the dreamers. And the bottom line is that this administration never generates executive orders that help us, and it never supports legislation that will benefit us either. Meanwhile, the beat goes on. Both sides in Washington want to know, how are we going to pay for it? How are we going to pay for it? How are we going to pay for it? How should we reply? We pay for public purpose legislation the way we always do. Congress appropriates money for it. The Fed creates the money to spend and places it in the Treasury spending account. It would be really good if we could make that fully explicit instead of being the result of complicated rules. By fully explicit, I mean it would be really good if we could force the Congress to place a section in each fiscal bill that tells the Federal Reserve to place the reserves that are needed for a particular spending appropriation into the Treasury spending account directly upon the passage of the appropriations bill involved. If we could get that done, it would banish an awful lot of the bullshit we see in relation to budgeting and federal spending, federal fiscal spending. That is the fantasy that this is created, that the new reserves are created, that the Treasury spends, are created by anything other than Congress appropriating the money and the Fed, with its delegated authority from the Congress, creating the reserves, the high-powered reserves that are placed in the Treasury account. It would make that very, very explicit and make it clear that it's the money appropriated by Congress going into the Treasury account, and that it has nothing to do with taxes. That taxes do not fund spending. Congress, combined with the power it delegated to the Federal Reserve, is what's funding spending. Then the Treasury spends the money by sending reserves or checks to private sector accounts. The progress towards public purpose depends upon how Congress votes and how it legislates. There are no constraints upon it except those put into place by the budgetary austerians in Congress. So the big questions are, do you want to live or die? Do you want your grandkids to live or die? Do you want the earth to live or die? If your choice is life, then call out the budgetary austerians. Whether it's Paul Ryan or whether it's Keith Ellison playing the progressive give-up game. Tell them how you're going to pay for it doesn't work anymore. Tell them you won't tolerate deficit reductions anymore. Tell them they have to deficit spend big to solve our problems. Tell them if they don't, then they're gone after the elections of 2018. And the further answer, organize to get a whole new slate of legislators in 2018 and elect people who know why you're kicking the old guys and gals out and who will act in your interest, not in the interests of private profit. How do we organize? Join real progressives. Join real progressives. Swell our ranks. Make us an important factor in 2018. We stand for equality. We stand for economic justice. We stand for democracy. We stand for saving the good earth. We stand for peace with justice. We stand for universal free health care. Everybody in, nobody out. We stand for innovation. We stand for a Green New Deal. We take care of our own. We stand for Black Lives Matter because Black lives are our own. Join us in ending plutocracy and inverted totalitarianism. Join us in creating an America for all of us. So that's it for my commentary tonight. It's now time for our Q&A, and I know I've missed a lot of questions. I've missed a lot of comments. I apologize for that. I just wanted to do a good job on the delivery of my message. And so I'll wait now for your questions and for your further commentary. And we'll see what we can drag about these issues now and how we can motivate ourselves to climb the high mountain that we must climb. There's really no alternative. We climb that mountain, or it's our very lives. So let's get to it. Let's get to it. Okay, thank you for your comments. I'm glad you liked the talk. How about some questions? How about some questions? How about some questions? Oops. How can, by Carmen Munez asks, I'm sorry, Stacy Van Veen says, I can't assign any beneficent motives for the Republican agenda, nor the Democrats for that matter. Well, there is a little bit of goodwill behind the CPC budget, I think, Stacy, but not really enough to make a difference. And Carmen Munez says, Dr. Joe, how can we effectively challenge donors not to keep funding the corrupt parties? Well, I think some of them have already been challenged and are responding. George Soros made public very recently that he has given $18 billion to a network of foundations that will help things out, that will support open society and civil society all over the world, including the United States. Okay, that's a considerable part of his fortune. He's very serious about that. Some of his funding goes to people that we think are doing very good work. I don't know whether the announcement of $18 billion means that there will be more going to our side. There will be more going to progressive causes, but that kind of donation certainly suggests that he won't be allocating very much of his money to the political parties in the future, as he sometimes did in the past. I think that's actually been in the works since 2012, when he developed a great degree of unhappiness with what the Obama administration was doing. Okay, Mark Collins says, Nathan Scott Shoemaker, very good question. The appropriate federal taxes should be based on how the assets are affecting the economy in terms of flow. This is still being studied, but there are some very sound generalities that are not being implemented. Yes, that's, I'm not sure. I have to see the original question here in order to give a good answer. So let me go back, see if I can find it. I have very little space here to actually see the comments. It says, I'm transmitting in multiple dimensions. Yes, I don't know what's causing that. There seemed to be interruptions going on in the feed all night that usually don't occur in my feeds. I have no idea what's causing it. I suppose there's some weather going on somewhere. Now, I can't find with the original question. If taxes are to maintain demand for the dollar, then what is the appropriate distribution tax on corporations who are rich and individual resident, homeowner, wage earners? Well, okay, I think, just in terms of general principles, I think that, but right now, we don't have to worry about people with low-end incomes, okay, and also middle incomes leaving the dollar, because they're paying a sufficient level of taxation through sales taxes, okay, and also through the income taxes, that they have a vested interest in continuing to trade in the dollar, okay. Now, for some of the wealthy people, if they want to make money here, then they have to trade in dollars themselves. So I think we're really a long way away from the point where our taxing patterns are somehow threatening the ability of the dollar, of our taxes, to drive the currency. So that's my answer to that. We can't give an exact answer to that. We frankly don't know what it is. I suppose that some of the MMTers are doing simulation now to see if they can get a better and more precise answer to that question. It's a very interesting and significant question, but it may be very, very hard to simulate that. Rob Rye asked me, Yoda, how do you feel about the university levels still teaching neoliberal economics, and what can we do to challenge or change this? Well, I think what we can do is a lot more of what we're doing. In other words, spreading alternative perspectives on economics, on social media, on the internet, challenging the perspectives of the neoliberals. There will come a time when their views are so subject to a lack of respect in the broader the public that the universities will start to hire post-Keynesians of one kind or another, okay, and MMT people, and will begin to hire them as younger faculty members, with a few of our leading lights getting into senior positions. And this is a slow process, but slowly the editorial boards of the journals will change, Slowly, the compositions of the faculties are going to change. Slowly, the generations will change. And slowly, as happens to all of us, the neoliberals are going to die out, and new schools of economics will come to the fore. It may be 10 or 15 years before we start to see these effects. But I think increasingly economists who can perform, like the MMT economists, will be getting critical public sector jobs to practice their economics. And when that economics seems to work, then these people will be returning to the universities in many cases to teach at the universities. When Stephanie Kelton left the budget committee, I believe she originally had intended perhaps to return to the position she had, at UMKC. But she certainly had no trouble in getting an offer from Stony Brook when she needed one. And of course, I think that was in part because of her government service and her Washington experience. Sorry, Carmen, which donation to UMKC were you referring to? Well, maybe I should ask this of Mark Collins. Which one you're referring to? George donated a large sum to UMKC. I'm not aware of that. So I guess I'd certainly appreciate a link to that. Okay. I'm aware of George funding the research work of some people in the MMT group. Okay, I'm aware of that. Okay. Not George personally, actually, but the INET Foundation that he funded gave out a lot of grants to academics, and among those academics were some of the MMTers. Whether there was a large sum of money involved, I don't know. I suspect that there are actually fairly small sums involved. I'd be surprised if his support for the UMKC Center, or for the MMT efforts is anywhere near the amount that Warren Mosler provided to help to get the movement in academia started in the first place. Warren was very, very generous. Okay, Kathy Butari says, if you had to take an educated guess, when do you see a job guarantee happening in America? She refers to the FJG, the federal job guarantee. That stands for George who? George Soros, Teresa. Okay, anyway, Kathy, okay, I really think that's up to us. We have to get a large group of congressional people who favor MMT, who can speak a little bit of MMT, and who can write that kind, of bill, or get people on their staffs who can write that kind of bill, and who believe what we say about the job guarantee. I think the earliest that will happen is probably in the decade of the 2020s. Might be early in that decade, but I think it will probably need to follow another crash by creating a large group, okay, of unemployed people who want to work and who favor employment more than they want a basic income guarantee. Because the neoliberals are going to push for basic income guarantees, certainly. Mark Collins said, "I saw this about a month ago. I will try to find it. I was interacting with a Justice Dem who got spooked about that." Why are the Justice Dems anti-George Soros? Yeah, they probably are, knowing them. So, Russell Gorman says, "I like it that the job guarantee replaces the military as the employer of last resort." So do I. And I think people will like it better too. The reason being that the job guarantee will pay a lot more than the military does. In other words, if they have the job guarantee, people will be able to get married and to settle down and to have a family and to work at jobs they like and to travel to different parts of the country knowing that a job will await them at the other end when they want to relocate, when they want to get out of Flint, Michigan, and move to a more pleasant place. They'll be able to do that. Any more questions or comments? Awesome points of consideration. Well, okay. I thank you very much, Russell, but they seem like common sense to me. Okay, Mark Collins is going to try to find that reference to a large grant from Soros to UMKC. I certainly hope that that's true, because that is all to the good. Any more comments? The only worry I have with respect to UMKC is that that state is so conservative that it seems to me that if the department gets too political at some point in the future, it might have a visit from some of the crazy elected officials in that state, or maybe from the neoliberal Democratic senators that they also seem to like to elect. I don't know whatever happened to the home state of Harry Truman and Stu Symington. It's terrible. Yeah, what did the Justice Democrats get spooked by? Okay, so I don't see many questions. It looks like things are winding down. What I'd like to remind you about now, but before I close, is that I am the author of 7 MMT related books. They are Kindle ebooks. They're inexpensive, okay, at $10 each, okay, and they are at Amazon. And they are advertised on my book site, which is www.josephmfirestone.com. And I'd like to urge you to go there and to consider buying the ones that interest you. I would like to write some more books at some time in the future. I think I have another 7 books in me. And if these first 7 books would sell in any quantity, then I'd be able to do 7 more. And I think those would be even better than the first 7 books. I'm asked the question, can you port your books to Apple? Well, the books are available on Apple because they are Kindle ebooks, and you can download Kindle software to the Apple, and you can download Kindle software to the PC. It's just software that you download. Once you've downloaded the software, you buy the book, and you have it on your machine. And not only on one machine, but if I recall correctly, you can download it to 6 of your machines. So you can have the books on all of your devices. Okay. So if you would remember to occasionally do that for me and to peruse the books, and perhaps from time to time to buy one, and also to visit the Patreon page I have. I have one that is advertised on my book site. In other words, there's a button, okay, that will lead you to the Patreon page. Okay, and then if you would like to become a patron of my activities, including these live streaming activities, but also my writing activities, then I would certainly appreciate that as well. And James W. Nicholas says, you write them, we'll buy and read them. Well, that would be great. And I'll say again, you can certainly start with the first 7. I know I'm prejudiced, but I think they're all very good books. Okay, I got a question the other day, or there was a question, okay, on one of the Facebook pages. It was the People's Convergence conference page, and one of their people asked a question that in part dealt with Greece, and whether Greece could have gotten out of its fix by creating essentially Greek versions of the euro, not by going back to the drachma, but creating euro currency using the printing press that they currently use to create that kind of currency, but printing beyond the mandate, okay, that was given them by the Eurozone authorities. okay, by the European Central Bank. And I said at the time that there were difficulties in that, and pointed out that I considered that and brought out the problems connected with it, and also suggested a solution in my book on austerity and the crisis in Greece, which is one of the 7 books. And that exact question was considered in that book, and an answer was given. So the answer, with its advantages and with its limitations, is right in that book. I even suggested a technological answer to the question of how to reconvert to the drachma with a minimum, okay, of effort, if the Greeks would like to do that. My technical answer to that question was discussed and poo-pooed on Naked Capitalism in a number of blogs going back and forth on that. But I still think my technical situation, that my technical solution to that was a good one, and in line with modern web services-based technology. Some of you may know, and some of you may not, but I have a very substantial background within the knowledge management field. And one of the books I've written, okay, is an IT book dealing with many of the information technology aspects of the portal technology. Okay, and that book is both in ebook form, okay, and in print form. It was published by Butterworth Heinemann, which is now a division of a much larger publishing company, which pays me royalties every 6 months or so, but whose name I am continually forgetting because the name of the company is not really on the check. What's on the check is a still higher level company that bought up that other company. In other words, there's been a whole lot of concentration going on in the publishing industry, and the company that I originally published with, which specialized in the knowledge management field, was eaten up by a somewhat larger company that in turn, okay, was eaten up by a giant, actually Taylor Francis Publishing. And so that's where the very small checks come in from now. Okay, but anyway, I was pretty heavy into that area. I was pretty advanced in studying web services technology. So Russell says, I would love to see the Greeks kick the euro to the curb. Yes, I would have loved to see the Greeks do that too, but even with all the suffering they've had, the Greeks want very much to stick with the EU. I'm not sure they want to stick with the Eurozone, but I think they can't get out of the Eurozone without also getting out of the EU. And so that's the problem there. Okay. So, anyway, thank you very much for attending. It's now 9:56. Okay, and unless there are some further questions that pop up, I'm going to call it a night, and I'm going to leave with the word that uh, we're really up against it. And we need to keep fighting. I know we are fighting. Okay, I know RP is fighting. And that Steve is fighting to the best of his ability, and I am fighting to the best, okay, of my ability as well. And all of us together are doing the best we can in a situation where we can only be volunteers and do things part-time. So I urge you who work with us and who like to watch us, okay, and who like to, to listen to us, to fight with us. If you all fight with us, and if our families and friends fight, and if we keep on growing, we eventually will win. We will get the country we want. We will save our children and our grandchildren. We can, and we will win. So thank you again, and thank you a lot. And I'll see you next week, certainly on Saturday night. I hope to have Jeff Ginter returning next week for a further discussion of a progressive policy agenda. He wasn't able to be with us tonight because he was celebrating his wife's birthday, a very, very worthwhile celebration. In fact, it was a command performance, I'm sure, except I don't think he viewed it that way. Okay, and neither would I. So again, a good night all. And I'm sure we'll be exchanging various messages during the week.